I was talking to a friend of mine who's not from the South about Southern culture, and one question that they had was simply, why is it that the South has a reputation for what's known as Southern hospitality, while they also have a reputation for being ignorant, bigoted, or racist? And it's actually quite interesting because the two are actually intertwined, and you can read about it in books like Incidents of a Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs. Now, historically speaking, Southern hospitality was a real thing. There are multiple accounts of people being greeted warmly at plantations with few questions asked, and there's also written accounts of there not being very many taverns in the South because people simply stayed at each other's houses. However, the reasons behind Southern hospitality are a bit more complicated and nuanced. One of the reasons why people were so hospitable was because it was easier. It's easy to be hospitable if you have people doing the hard work for you. And this can be people cooking your food for you or simply keeping things clean, especially if that's unpaid labor. There's other reasons too, for instance, the issue of optics. And Jacobs writes about this, in that there would be abolitionist politicians who would come down to the South to see what slavery was like because they were concerned about the ethics of it. And what slave owners and plantation owners alike would do was that they would show them an extremely sanitized version of slavery. And they would usually bring the politician up to some slave and be like, "Are you happy living here?" And given no option, the slave just simply has to say, "Yes, I'm happy living here." And that convinced a great deal of politicians that slavery wasn't nearly as bad or exploitative as it was. And that kind of continued on throughout the 19th century, where it was important to have positive optics so that people didn't try to take away your livelihood. Another factor is tension, and tension is actually where we get a lot of facets of Southern culture that still are around today, such as politeness, as well as an enthusiasm for gun ownership. Because the thing is that when you're owning slaves, there is the constant fear of revolt, and that fear and tension elevates into stress. So this creates a culture where people are very polite to one another, but also where people are usually constantly armed, because they're trying to make sure that they aren't revolted against, but they're also trying to make sure that they are not creating stress for other people. And this escalates over time in American history. There are multiple things such as the Haitian Revolution, as well as several rebellions that occur in the 19th century that eventually culminate into the Civil War, where people's stress levels start to become elevated and slave owners start cracking down more on their slaves. And this manifests into a culture of extreme politeness, as well as one where people are constantly paranoid about revolt or being attacked somehow. However, over time, the cultural practice of Southern hospitality was adopted not just by people of the planter or slave owner class, but by people of lower classes as well. And it still exists today, as well as several forms of that paranoia I was talking about earlier, where you have things like doomsday preppers, people who are starting their own militias, people who are concerned about government overreach, and there is still very much a highly enthusiastic gun culture in the southern United States. Southern hospitality is a very nuanced thing because it does have a bit of a dark past given its context. However, it is still applied today in very broad terms, where there is a great degree of personal charity that doesn't necessarily extend to systemic relief. There's also the fact that it does depend on appearance. There are things such as sundown towns that still exist in several parts of the US, where people of color can't be in a town past dark. There's also the fact that there would be cast judgment on people, and the extent of hospitality that they would receive would depend on how you looked to them. However, it is tied to race, intimately so, and I think it's important to recognize that when trying to understand the history of the South and the United States as a whole.